Thank you for joining us today to another Central Elevation webinar. I'm your host, Nando Mogollon. And today we will be talking about 4D and sequencing. But we're going to talk about it from the point of view of an Archicad user who's working on a project, and then you need to export a model so that someone else will do the sequencing. Now, because I know that that might not be the case for everyone, we're also going to take a brief look at how you will ever do that if you had to do your own model. Now, it's kind of a loophole because it's typically we'll model for the purpose of documentation, not for the purpose of construction simulation. But if it comes to that and you have a project that it's small enough and you want to try out, we'll give you a brief look on that. So without any more delay, let's start with today's presentation. Today we will be covering a few concepts to begin with. The whole idea of taking a look at this is to embracing this whole idea of 4D sequencing, but within the concept or the framework of general building information modeling, not only for the purpose of Archicad. So we need to take a brief look at what Ifc and the MVDs or model view definitions are saying about sequencing if such a thing exists. Then we're going to take a look at the concept of both granularity and the level of detail or level of information need, which is nothing but just the additional data that tends to be attached to those model geometries and entities. And we want also to take a look at a differentiation of the design model against a construction model, which are not necessarily the same kind of thing. Then we will jump right away into Archicad. We'll do a brief exercise on modifications to a translator for the purpose of exporting a model that may be feasible or easier to handle when you're using a proper sequencing software tool, and which kind of modifications you actually need to do to the model elements so that the actual model seems more like a construction model rather than just a design model. And then, as I promised, close to the end, we will take a look at simulating a 4D sequencing just within Archicad. We'll use that by using a relatively old construction simulation add-on that still works within some limitations, but it works well for the purpose of what we're trying to do here. All right, let's start with the brief concepts we want to cover. Let's take a look at the general process that we all are in the same page. What we're proposing here is that we will effectively take a model from Archicad, model that you've been using for your own purposes of design and documentation. Then we're going to export that through Ifc, but we want to create a translator so that the Ifc that comes out of it serves the purpose for future sequencing. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, we may also need to adjust the actual model so that it works for construction sequencing. As in general, we recommend that model to be checked, even if it's just briefly, into Solibri or any other Ifc viewer for the purpose of validating the model before you send it out. And then, of course, the purpose-built software application will take care of the actual simulation. Now, the ones I have here on the screen are just a sample. We're not recommending those. It's just a general sample of what you will find out there in the market, and there might be more things coming in. Synchro, Navisworks, Bexel, iConstruct, etc. Now, what is important to mention or to clarify here is this idea that this Ifc that you export from Archicad in our case, and for those using Revit, then it will be Revit. For those using some other kind of tool, Blender and or Rhino or whatever else, what is important is that this Ifc should be built as close as possible to a construction model, so that when someone else reads the model, they have to do, they don't get confused by whatever you have modeled in here. And that's where the next concept comes in, which is granularity and the level of detail. Now, before we jump into that, what does the actual current literature says about this? So for one side, model view definitions, as you can find them right away, this is a screenshot of a few minutes ago. A model view definition list will display the list of current definitions. You'll see which one is a draft, which is official, which one has been withdrawn. And currently, both Ifc 4 and Ifc 2x3 do carry on certain model view definitions that you'll find in there that will serve the purpose of the construction sequencing. Now, what you will not find is a specific MVD with the name sequencing or construction simulation or anything like that. But generally speaking, Ifc 2x3 coordination view serves that purpose as it was defined initially. And in theory, the Ifc, that's the coordination view 2x3, and then for Ifc 4, the reference view should serve that purpose. Again, currently I haven't been able to find any additional information if there is any future development for that specific purpose, but there might be, and if there is, it will be great, although I'm not sure if there's any need for that. When it comes to the actual schema, so that's the available data and entities and properties and everything that the software can hold, or the format, I should say, rather than the format, the software. What the format Ifc can hold that refers to sequencing tend to do with essentially these few entities here. And those are everything that falls within the process extension, which is essentially types and entities. As I understand, Ifc entities are new to Ifc 4. And within there, what you'll have are things like events and tasks and things that will control those events and tasks. Beyond that, there's also relationships that will apply to this. And those tend to be to actors that are associated to the events and then eventually associated to the building elements. Now, I'm pretty sure you're not right into the programming of Ifc stuff, so we'll leave it there. Just out of curiosity, if you want to find these, you just need to go to the Building Smart website. Let me see if I can bring it in briefly so you see that. You should be able to find that over the standards.buildingsmart.org. And then within there, you'll find all the current contents of of both schema 4 and 2x3. So you'll find it there, and then you keep clicking along. You'll find, what an Ifc actor will do and how does it relate to anything else, etc., etc. Now let's jump in to Archicad to talk about granularity and design models versus construction models. Okay, so what we have here, nothing new to you. You have seen this model since, if you have been following these webinars from the beginning. This is the sample building we've been mimicking a real building, although it isn't. This is a model we'll be using for the purpose of doing the exercises. Now, if you're familiar with it, then you'll see some few bits and pieces that we have been using for the sake of running our exercises. What I want to show you here is that, let's say we're starting from the point of view of having this as a single design model. What it means by design model is that you will likely have things that works pretty well for the sake of displaying your drawings and the general look of the building. And for that, you build, curtain walls that have a bunch of sub-elements, but they are essentially a single bit. Or if I take a look at the ground floor in a cut view, you will use composite walls, timber stud with plasterboards on the side, and that's just, regular way for you to build relatively complex elements from within Archicad. You don't need to build every single bits and pieces just for the sake of putting that together. Now, that level of granularity can be built within Archicad, but you actually have some level of control over how to export that. Now, we saw this probably in webinar 16 or so, but if you don't remember, cool, attend to that. By the way, you can catch up on YouTube on those webinars. There is a playlist for that. The whole purpose of building such elements is that then you can, by using specific translators, you should be able then to define to what level of granularity the resulting IFC will be built. In my case, similar to what we have done in the past, I have built a specific translator for the purpose of exporting this model for construction simulation. And the geometry conversion, in my case, will be the one that will take care of that level of granularity. Now, I want to focus on a couple of specific things that will help you getting a healthy IFC for that specific purpose. From the top, let's begin with the geometries which participate in collision detection. Maybe not that correctly worded in here. Yes, it will be exporting either the geometries that do have materials which participate in collision detection, which is a property of your building materials. Now, for the purpose of clash detection and services coordination, that might not be an issue. But in this case, you are more likely to unselect that option so that it actually exports everything, including those type of the elements that use that type of material. Think of insulations, but also voids and timber studs or steel studs and so on, which may not be that critical for collision detection or crash detection. In this particular case, those need to be part of the sequence, so you actually want to export that. So recommended, just leave that unticked. Then if, depending on whether you're using 2x3 or IFC4, you actually want to use BREP representation or boundary representation. And if you catch our last webinar, we were talking about that, and the basic way to understand it will be that those boundary representations are explicit geometries. So IFC actually builds the geometry based on every single corner, edge, and face of the geometry solids, or construction elements for that, what it is. Rather than building, things like extrusions and constructed solid geometries and so on, which are based on a series of rules that will build the element in that way. You don't want to do that. You want to rely on the boundary representation for the sake of the construction simulation. These three here will control the level of granularity of the three system tools in Archicad. So currently they are, for Archicad 24 at least, the curtain wall, the stair, and the railing tools. And you can actually turn them into a single element, therefore not exporting the individual parts. Or you can keep the hierarchy, and then the resulting IFC will consider the element to be built out of parts. So we want to keep the hierarchy. Why? Because it's more likely that, say, as we were taking a look in this project that I have there in the background, a full curtain wall may be spanning over multiple floors, but you actually want to provide the individual elements for construction simulation so that the person running the simulation can control what's going to happen for individual floors or type of elements. Same principle will apply for stairs and railings. Split complex building elements. That will be the case for mostly composites and complex profiles, but also some objects and a few other elements, depending on how they were built. So these are the few things you can actually control from the translator for the sake of the granularity of the geometry. Okay. Now, a word on property mapping. This properties we were talking about when we mentioned these properties in the IFC schema. Let me see if we can back to that. These ones here, they are entities and types and so on that actually do not belong to the geometry, and therefore Archicad will not be able to apply properties for that as it goes. It relates to creating relationships in between that physical, or well, virtual element, and then an actor, and then a task, and then an event. And that's something that Archicad, since it is an architectural authoring tool, is not designed for. So therefore, you will see that even though if you look for them, there's not going to be a particular P set or individual entities, either in IFC 4 or IFC 3, that will comply to, anything other than element, building elements and the types. So you won't get to do that. Now, you can argue that, and there's nothing to stop you from doing this, you can argue that you can actually create a property set of your own for the sake of transferring information about the construction sequencing. If you're doing that and you're within Australia and New Zealand, which is where this webinar is mainly aimed for, then the only thing that I will recommend, or at least take a look at before you actually go ahead and create your own made up parameters, will be taking a look at NatSpec for Australia. I'm not sure which one will be in New Zealand for this particular purpose. And then in there, you'll be able to catch the properties generator. And they offer a couple of property categories and individual properties for construction logistics and scheduling data. We can argue that you can start using Kobe and et cetera, but that's a subject, so extent that we'll try to avoid it, at least for the purpose of this one webinar here, but it is relevant as well. Now, if you're gonna keep it on the simpler side, take a look at these properties from the NatSpec website, and then you'll see things like fabrication time, installation time, status, which is an actual common property that applies to everything, but it doesn't tell you much other than whether the element is existing, to be demolished, a temporary object, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a few other parameters that you can find in there. If you want to add more, feel free to do it. You just need to apply those to the elements you want to apply them, and then generate some sort of a link to your own Archicad properties or similar. All right, enough said in here. That's pretty much the extent of my translator. But yes, I've added a specific preset for each, since that's what I tend to do to protect all the other translators from being changed, so that I can manipulate the elements that I have in here. And most of the principles we have talked about in all the webinars apply here. So that will take care of things like this curtain wall, which now is going to be built out of sub-elements, walls like that one there. But then you will argue that, let's say in a building like this, all of that tiling in that floor may not be placed at the same time. Now, that is something that can be done from the side of a proper sequencing tool. But if you need to do it from your own side, and that might be the case, then you will need to start splitting something that normally, or for the purpose of design, will be a single element, like that tiling there, and then split it into bits and pieces just for the sake of adjusting the model and turning it from a design model to a construction model. So the level of detail that you add to the model, typically by splitting elements, is the kind of modifications that you may find yourself doing only for the purpose of turning it into something that you can later on use for sequencing. So this is what I've done in this particular case. I've added, just splitting these few floors in here. I think I did it on the back there. Didn't do too much, but I'll try to show you that on the other side. Now, we have exported these already, which is time that I'm not going to take you to, since we only have about another 10 minutes. And then we have exported this, as I regularly do. I've applied a particular view with a with a specific translator on a publisher set. So I've done that. And the first thing, as we always do, is go and take a look at that model with an Ifc Viewer. And this is what I've got in here. And the kind of things that I want to check is the actual granularity to see if it actually worked. To do so, let's start by just going closer here, and then you start picking an element. So the curtain walls are built of single elements as they are individual entities, but then if you take a look at what Solibri does, Solibri recognizes the parent element, but it also recognizes basic relationships that comes within the element in the Ifc file. So that one is, for instance, an element that is decomposed by individual bits and pieces. A couple of doors, those are those two there, members and plates. And plates, which are actually part of the element. Now, if you can take a look at that from this point of view, you can double click on any of these elements, and they will be individually selected, and you will be able to see, their own individual properties, types, names, materials, their own basic relationships, which typically will be telling you that they're part of a bigger element, like so. And the same principle will apply for frames and the doors and so on. You can also take a look at that if you want to take a look at something else like the walls and how they've been there. For instance, these walls here. You can find also the relationships right there. It decomposes into element parts. A section plane in here. So, and you'll be able to see that it will recognize the boards if that was the case, and in other elements if you need to find them individually. You can also take a look at building element parts up here, and then they'll be divided by their types. So, for instance, these timber studs should be right here, and they can be selected individually from the actual boards. So that's the whole purpose of building it up and exporting it by splitting the elements into individual parts and keeping the hierarchy of the different system tools as they come out of Archicad. That'll help quite a lot when you're trying to do a sequencing out of this model. Now, I don't have Synchro, I don't have iConstruct, I don't have anything that I could use to show you how that works, which is essentially assigning a timeline or a pre-built construction schedule to this. But I can show you something similar, and for that, we're just going to jump back to Archicad. And what I have in here is, let's say you actually want to mimic what happens in the sequencing tool, but now you'll do it in inside Archicad. For that, actually forgot to mention something else. Let me jump back to Solibri. Another thing you tend to do from within your files in Archicad is to build groups out of elements. Let me reset this. And you probably remember this because we did it very early in the process. We were actually building relationships or custom-made relationships in between element parts. For instance, this canopy here, I have it as a group that I built inside Archicad, not an Archicad group, but an actual Ifc group. And we have built this bunch of elements as if it was an individual group of parts. So you can make these kind of, they're not technically speaking assemblies, but you can call up the attention of those and say, hey, this should be an individual item, and then probably pass the information that you want this to be built by a specific person or a specific company, and so on. Okay, back to what we were. So what I've done in here is I've got those Ifc models back into Archicad, not using my own working model. I'm actually using the same Ifc for the purpose of being able to use those sub-elements that I can't really manipulate if I'm just using my Archicad file. So let's similar view. So what I have in here is same model, same everything, but then this time, if I take a closer look, what I have in here is a model that it's actually split into its individual parts. So now, because of that, I can manipulate what happens and I can build schedules on those. The only items that I'm missing in here will be anything that relates to a timeline and individual tasks and, probably when are they going to happen and so on. So in order to do that, the one thing that I can do, and let me jump back to, the one thing you can do is download this is a free download from the Graphics of Archicad website for add-ons and goodies, as they used to be called. And this one is called the construction simulation. If you have it already, or if you download it and install it, all you need to do is go to the document menu. Not really sure why it is sitting there, but that's what it is. Listing extras, and then construction simulation. Now, that's going to give you the option to show a task list, which is your main working window for this, or a palette. You can either open an existing project, save it, or create an animation, which will give you the advantage of seeing on a video what's happening with the construction sequence. Now, beyond that, what I'll do is I'll show you this task list that I have built for this, and you get this type of interface. This is just made up. I just built that based on my own whims. Nothing special about that. But what I wanted to show you here is the following. This palette will be able to create individual tasks that will have a timeline. So they'll start on a date and finish on another date. They can be indicative of things that will be built, demolished, restore, so didn't exist and then come back to life, freeze, temporarily freeze, or just temporary items which show up and then hide or disappear at some point. Now, because of this fairly simple exercise, all I've done is I've added something that looks like a typical construction sequence when I'm starting with the slabs and then the columns and then everything else in some order. But now I'll be using those sub-elements to be able to display something that looks more like what's going to happen on the construction side. Now, the beauty of this is you will be able to create those tasks and then link them to building elements, which is something you do essentially just by selecting them or using find and select or whatever means you think are necessary. And then after that, you'll be able to identify which elements are linked to which tasks simply by clicking these select linked items. In this case, there's a few slabs down there, columns like so, some of the curtain wall frames, some of the partition, which I've divided in two. So I'm planning to build the internal partitions of this group in here, and then I'll add build the external ones, and then later on I'll be adding the actual boards to those partitions, and so on and on and on. So you can create those links in between your tasks and the elements, which by the way, you need to do it in plan view. Might be one of those limitations of the add-on. And mind you, Archicad is not meant to be a sequencing tool, but this is good enough for something that comes for free, essentially. So you can build this either to this level of detail, or as I tend to do, just facing it or saying, hey, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, month 1, week 1, something like that. So it doesn't have to be that specific. And then I relate that to different building elements. Now, both your plan views or sections or the 3D views can actually react to this sequence, which is kind of cool. So, for instance, I have these as if it was starting today and ending on the 6th of November. So I have just a few days in between different stages or different tasks in here. If I choose this current date to be today, and I show build, what the add-on will do for you is to go ahead and hide everything that is not being currently built. And it gives you sort of a brief idea here by saying, hey, those slabs at the ground floor will be partially built, so 50%. I'm just going to move these to the side to show you what happens then in 3D with that. Then the 3D will react to that. Now, mind you, this is just me not adding absolutely everything just for the sake of the exercise. So these now will be showing some level of progress to that. So this is going to be our starting point. If we go ahead and move these, let's say, to 2 days later, now the slabs will be done and then columns will be within progress. So built. Columns will be shown in here. And then columns, because they're still being built, they tend to be green in color. Now, mind you, that green color comes from a surface that, sort of gives them an override, temporary override that gets controlled by the add-on. And so on. I can just jump ahead into, let's say, the 20th of October. Show build. Oh, the 19th. We get just partial framing. Okay. You'll see them partially built in your plan view and also partially built on your 3D view, like so. So you can actually effectively use this with this particular tool to go ahead and play around. Actually, let's going to move ahead closer to the final date of the construction. Most of everything is being built, except for doors which have not been placed quite yet. But you can tell how these will react quite nicely to that construction simulation. Not doing it here, it'll take probably a little bit and doesn't really look that great, but it serves the purpose. If you want to export also the actual simulation view of this, you can actually go ahead and say create an animation, which can create that movie from just a simple 3D window, which it's not too bad for what it is. Or you want to be really fancy, you can go for photo rendering, and if you have the time, of course, you can use the photo rendering window, which in this then we'll use either the internal one, which is not as good, or the scene render one. That's the extent of it. This is not being saved with views, so that will be another limitation, but you can use it on the fly. It can be reflective of your plan views if you just leave it static like so. The only thing you won't be able to do is to print a drawing with one date and another drawing with another date at the same time. So you have to go and move one at a time. But you can see that there is some advantage to that if you are in the position where you need to take control over that. This particular simulation can be then saved. You can go ahead and say, save that, or open a different one, which is kind of nice. You can actually have multiple construction simulations or schedules for a single project and just load them every now and then. Just mind you that you need to keep an eye on unlinked items, which is most of them in this case, items that have not been included into that simulation. All right, we're just a little bit over time, but that is the extent of what I wanted to show you on construction simulation. All right, so I hope that was useful for you guys. If you have any questions, and I can see there are a couple. Okay, for those of you in Australia, if you want to keep an eye on any coming webinars, that link there on the screen and the QR code will take you to a live calendar, which will allow you to subscribe not only to the future webinars of this series, but any other additional webinars that we're running on almost on a daily basis. Getting help in Australia and New Zealand is just a matter of going to mycicentralinnovation.com, calling the support hotline, or sending an email to both support email addresses, both in Australia and New Zealand. Again, don't forget to register and check out all the other content we have on myci at centralinnovation.com. That is all for today. Stay tuned for next week. We will continue with just an additional webinar on the matter of special use cases. That will be for costing. Then we'll jump quickly for a couple of webinars that we want to run essentially based on the idea of quality assurance. And we'll heavily focus on Solibri, to some extent with the relationship in between Archicad and Solibri, but essentially inside Solibri in how to double check things for validation of IFC models that you may need to deliver under certain project circumstances. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next week. Till then.